Here, in the heart of a forgotten winter, where the land holds its breath under a shroud of white, there lies a story. It is a tale etched not in stone, but in the frozen marrow of the earth itself. It whispers on the wind that scours the barren fields of Exeter, Rhode Island, a place where the 19th century was breathing its last ragged gasps. The year is 1892. The air is thin and sharp, a shard of glass in the throat. The silence is not peaceful. It is a heavy, weighted thing, the kind of silence that follows a scream you never heard. It is the silence of anticipation, of a terror that has not yet been given a name. This is not a story of monsters with wings of leathery darkness or fangs that glint in moonlight. It is a story of a monster, born from something far more common, far more intimate. Love and grief, and a fear so profound it could turn a father's hand against his own beloved dead. It is a story of a sickness that devoured a family from the inside out, a sickness of the lungs they called consumption, but a sickness of the soul that they would come to call by a much older, darker name. This is the story of Mercy Lena Brown, the girl they called a vampire. And to understand her story, you must first understand the cold. You must understand the isolation. You must understand how in the deepest, darkest heart of winter, faith can curdle into folklore, and reason can freeze and shatter like ice on a river. The landscape of rural New England in the late 1800s was a study in stark contrasts. Life was a testament to endurance, a daily struggle waged against a land that was both beautiful and brutal. The summers were brief, a fleeting fever of green before the world gave way to the long, tyrannical reign of winter. And in the winter of 1892, that reign was absolute. Snow fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a judgment. It buried fences, erased roads, and sealed farmhouses into silent white tombs. The world shrank to the dimensions of your own four walls, the view from your window a monochrome expanse of white earth and black, skeletal trees. Communication with the outside world became a memory, a rumor. You were alone with your family, your thoughts, and your God, and whatever else might be hiding in the shadows. The people of Exeter were not primitive. They were hard-working, God-fearing folk, Protestants of a stern and stoic tradition. They read their Bibles, they trusted their doctors, and they believed in the steady, rational march of progress. They had telegraphs and railroads and newspapers that told them of a modern world brimming with invention and discovery. But beneath this thin veneer of modernity, the old ways persisted, the old fears. Deep in the collective memory, carried over from the bleak villages of old Europe, were tales of a different kind of sickness. A sickness that did not end with the grave, a belief that when a disease consumed a family, one member after another, the cause was not a germ, invisible and modern, but something ancient and predatory. It was the belief that the dead, in their cold and silent hunger, could feed upon the life force of the living, a parasitic undeath, a spiritual contagion that drained the vitality from its own bloodline. They didn't use the word vampire in the way we might imagine. Theirs was not a creature of Gothic romance. It was a homegrown horror, a thing of the soil, a deceased family member, a neighbor, a loved one, who simply would not stay gone. And into this world of piety and deep-seated superstition, this world of unforgiving cold and profound isolation, the affliction came to the house of George and Mary Eliza Brown. They were a respectable family, farmers who worked the unforgiving land with the same diligence as their ancestors. George Brown was a man of the earth, practical and sober. He had a wife, Mary Eliza, and a brood of children who were to be his future, his legacy. They lived in a modest farmhouse, its wood weathered to the color of slate by 100 unforgiving winters. Their lives were governed by the seasons, by the rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth, and inevitably of death. But the death that came to their door was not the clean, expected death of old age. It was a creeping thief, a shadow that fell over the house and refused to leave. It began, as these things often do, with a cough, a small persistent rattle in the chest of the mother, Mary Eliza. At first it was dismissed. A winter cold, a touch of bronchitis, nothing to trouble the stoic resolve of a farmer's wife. But the cough did not leave. It settled in, a permanent resident in her lungs. Her breath grew shorter. Her skin took on the translucent, waxy pallor of one who is slowly turning away from the world of the living. The town doctor, Harold Metcalf, a man of science and learning, made his diagnosis with a grave sigh. It was consumption, the wasting disease, tuberculosis. In the 19th century, this diagnosis was not a forecast. It was a death sentence. There was no cure. There was only the slow, inexorable process of being hollowed out from within. The family watched, helpless, as Mary Eliza faded. The vibrant woman who had run the household became a ghost confined to her bed, her world shrinking to the space between four walls. Her cough was the new rhythm of the house, a constant, wet punctuation to the suffocating silence. Sometimes she would cough up blood, bright crimson against the stark white of her handkerchief, a shocking flower of life blooming from the landscape of her decay. The neighbours brought broths and offered prayers. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes filled with a pity that was laced with something else, a primal fear. Sickness was a contagion, and this sickness seemed particularly relentless. In 1883, Mary Eliza Brown drew her last ragged breath. The house fell into a deeper quiet. George Brown buried his wife in the Chestnut Hill Cemetery under a cold and indifferent sky. He was now a widower, a father left to raise his children alone. He believed the worst was over. He was wrong. The shadow had not left his house. It had merely retreated, waiting. Grief is a winter of its own. It freezes the heart, slows the blood. For the Brown family, the years that followed Mary Eliza's death were a long, cold season of mourning. But life, relentless and demanding, had to go on. The cows still needed milking, the fields still needed tending. George and his children, Mary Olive, Edwin, and the youngest, Mercy, fell into a new, fractured routine. They carried on, bearing their loss with the quiet dignity expected of them. Yet the memory of their mother's decline lingered like a persistent chill in the air. The sound of her cough seemed to echo in the rafters of the house on quiet nights. A few years passed. The sharp edges of grief began to soften, and then the sickness returned. This time it chose the eldest daughter, Mary Olive. She was 20 years old, on the cusp of her own life, when the familiar pattern began. The fatigue, the fever that burned at night, and then the cough. It was the same cough, the same hollow, rattling sound that had heralded her mother's end. The diagnosis was the same: consumption. For George Brown, it was a waking nightmare. To watch a second loved one be consumed by the same invisible fire was a cruelty beyond comprehension. The community watched, too, and the whispers began to stir. Two in one family. A tragedy, yes, but also a pattern, an unnerving symmetry. The process of Mary Olive's decay was a grim echo of her mother's, the slow transformation from a vibrant young woman into a fragile, breathless wraith. The house once again became a sick room, heavy with the scent of herbal remedies and impending death. Hope dwindled, replaced by a grim resignation. Mary Olive died in 1886, just 3 years after her mother. She was laid to rest beside her in the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. The family plot was growing. The Brown family was shrinking. Now the fear in the community was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was palpable. The Brown house began to feel like a blighted place, a place marked by an unnatural misfortune. People began to speak of a curse, of a bad seed in the family's blood. The old stories, the ones their grandparents had told them around the fire on long winter nights, began to surface from the dark corners of their minds. Stories of the dead who were not truly at rest. The focus of the family's hope, and now their terror, settled on the only son, Edwin. He was a young man, strong and capable, the future of the Brown farmstead. For a time, he seemed to have been spared. He worked the farm with his father, a quiet, solemn presence. He even moved away for a time, seeking a healthier climate, perhaps seeking to outrun the shadow that clung to his family name. But the shadow had long arms. While away, he too fell ill. The same symptoms, the same inexorable decline. He returned home to Exeter, a defeated man, to be cared for by his father and his younger sister, Mercy. Edwin's illness was a slow, agonizing siege. He was wasting away before their eyes. His once strong frame became skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He fought, but it was a battle he was losing, day by day. And as Edwin weakened, the sickness, ever hungry, chose its next victim. Mercy Lena Brown. She was only 19 years old. She had cared for her ailing brother, breathing the same air, living under the same cursed roof. And now, the sickness had come for her. For Mercy, the disease was swift, merciless. While her brother's decline was a slow burn, hers was a raging fire. Her lungs, young and vital, were consumed with terrifying speed. The cough racked her small frame. The fevers, Lefty, are delirious. In the dead of winter, in January of 1892, Mercy Brown died. The farmhouse on the hill was now a house of ghosts. A father, a son, and the memory of 3 dead women. George Brown, a man broken by a succession of losses that defied all reason, had Mercy's body placed in an above-ground vault at the cemetery. The ground was frozen solid, too hard to dig a proper grave. There she would wait, in the cold, dark silence, until the spring thaw. The temporary nature of her resting place seemed to mirror the unsettling feeling that had gripped the entire community. Nothing felt permanent. Nothing felt safe. Death was not an end, but a lingering, predatory presence. With Mercy's death, the whispers in the village of Exeter became a roar. The fear, once a quiet suspicion, coalesced into a single, terrifying theory. This was not consumption. This was not a disease of the mortal world. This was the work of the undead. The pattern was undeniable, a perfect and horrifying reflection of the old folklore. One family member dies, and then another, and another, because the first is not truly gone. They are lying in their grave, preternaturally preserved, and through some dark, unknowable magic, they are drawing the life, the breath, the blood, from their surviving kin. The dead were feeding on the living. The focus of this terror began to center on one of the dead women. Who was it? Who was the ravenous one? Was it the mother, Mary Eliza, the first to fall? Was it the older daughter, Mary Olive? Or was it Mercy, the most recent to die, her body lying in the frozen darkness of the stone vault, so close to the world of the living? The fear was no longer abstract. It needed a name. It needed a face. It needed a body. And as Edwin Brown grew weaker with each passing day, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps, the fear escalated into a full-blown panic. The rational world of doctors and medicine had failed. Dr. Metcalf could offer sympathy, but no cure. The Brown family was being systematically annihilated, and the community felt the chill of that annihilation spreading. If it could happen to the Browns, It could happen to them. Sickness was one thing, a curse was another. A curse could spread. Neighbors who had once offered casseroles and condolences now looked at George Brown with a mixture of pity and dread. They were his friends, his community, but they were also terrified. They began to pressure him. They came to his house not with comfort, but with a grim and desperate proposition, a solution pulled from the darkest annals of their ancestral memory. They spoke of the old country, of the rituals their great-grandparents had known. They told him that to save his son, his only remaining child, he had to perform a terrible act. He had to face the source of the affliction. He had to go to the cemetery. He had to open the graves. The idea was monstrous, a violation of every sacred tenet he had been taught. To disturb the dead was a profound taboo, a sin against God and man. And these were not just any dead. They were his wife, his daughters. The thought of unsettling their final rest, of exposing their mortal remains to the harsh light of day, must have filled him with a horror that was almost suffocating. But then he would look at Edwin. He would see his son, a pale spectre in his sickbed, coughing his life away, and the logic of desperation would begin to take hold. What was one taboo when measured against the life of his son? What was the peace of the dead compared to the suffering of the living? The pressure mounted. It came from all sides. Friends, neighbors, respected members of the community. They were not malicious. They were terrified. They believed with the absolute conviction that only pure fear can inspire, that Edwin's life depended on this. This was their only hope. This was the only cure. The folklore was very specific about the ritual. They had to examine the bodies of the deceased. If one was found to be unnaturally preserved, with blood still in its heart, that was the one. That was the feeder. And to break the curse, the heart and sometimes the liver of the creature had to be cut out, burned to ash, and the ashes mixed with water and fed to the afflicted survivor. It was a gruesome pagan rite, a piece of medieval darkness resurrected in the supposed age of enlightenment. George Brown was a man caught in an impossible vice. On one side was his grief and his faith, his love and respect for the dead. On the other was the fading life of his last child and the crushing weight of his community's terror. The battle within him must have been agonizing. Every instinct would have screamed against the act of desecration, but every time he heard Edwin cough, a weak, wet sound from the other room, the voices of his neighbors would grow louder in his mind. The old fears, the dark logic of the vampire, began to seem not like madness, but like the only path forward. Finally, broken and desperate, George Brown consented. He would allow them to dig up his family. He would allow them to perform the ritual. He surrendered his modern sensibilities to an ancient, ravenous fear. The date was set. On the morning of March 17, 1892, a small group of men would gather at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. They would bring their shovels, their lanterns, and their dread. They were going to hunt for a monster, and they were going to hunt for it in the coffins of the Brown family. The morning of March 17th dawned grey and bitter. The sky was the colour of lead, and a wind that felt as if it had blown across 1,000 miles of ice swept through the bare trees of the cemetery. It was a day that felt designed for grim work. A small party of men gathered at the gates of Chestnut Hill. There was Dr. Metcalf, the man of science, present as an official witness, his presence a strange and unsettling bridge between the world of rational medicine and the dark ritual about to unfold. There was a reporter from a local newspaper, drawn by the morbid rumours, his pen and notepad ready to document the unbelievable, and there were several neighbours, their faces grim, their resolve hardened by fear. George Brown was there, of course, though he did not participate in the physical labour. He stood apart, a statue of grief, watching as these men prepared to violate the graves of his wife and daughters. The ground was still hard, but the very top layer had begun to yield to the first faint promises of spring. The men set to their work with a grim efficiency. The sound of their shovels striking the cold earth was the only sound, a rhythmic, percussive scraping that seemed to defile the sacred quiet of the place. They chose to open the graves of the mother and the elder daughter first. The work was slow, arduous. The earth clung to its dead, reluctant to give them up. Finally, they reached the coffin of Mary Eliza Brown. With crowbars and strained muscles, they pried open the lid. A collective breath was held. The sight within was exactly what one would expect after 9 years in the grave. The body was decomposed, reduced to little more than bone and tattered remains of her burial shroud. A sigh of relief, mixed with a grim satisfaction, passed through the men. This was not the one. They moved on. Next was the grave of Mary Olive, who had been dead for 6 years. Again they dug. Again they pried open the lid. And again they found what reason and nature dictated they should find. Her body, too, was in a state of advanced decomposition, skeletal, at peace. She was not the one either. The focus of the entire party, the entire weight of their fear and their desperate hope, now turned to the small stone vault built into the hillside. Inside lay the body of Mercy Brown. She had been dead for only 2 months. She had not been buried in the frozen earth, but stored in the cold, dark, tomb-like structure, protected from the elements. The air in the vault was frigid, stagnant. It smelled of stone and damp, and something else, something cloyingly sweet. They brought her coffin out into the pale, grey light of the March morning. It was a simple pine box. The men gathered around it, their breath pluming in the cold air. This was the final test, the moment of truth. With a groan of protesting wood, the lid was lifted. And then, a stunned, horrified silence fell upon the group. The men who had looked upon the skeletal remains of Mary Eliza and Mary Olive without flinching now recoiled, some gasping, some muttering prayers under their breath. For inside the coffin, Mercy Brown did not look dead, not in the way her mother and sister had. Her body was almost perfectly preserved. The frigid air of the vault had acted as a natural refrigerator, arresting the process of decay. But the men did not see science. They saw sorcery. To their terrified eyes, Mercy's face still held the shape and form of life. Her cheeks, they would later claim, were flushed with a subtle, rosy color. Her hair and nails appeared to have grown. When one of the men, perhaps the doctor, prodded her body, it was still supple. And then came the most damning discovery of all. They made an incision over her chest, a final terrible violation. They looked into her still heart, and they found it filled with dark, liquid blood. For a man of science like Dr. Metcalf, this was explainable. The very nature of tuberculosis, the wasting disease, could leave blood in the organs, and the freezing temperatures would have kept it from coagulating. The flushed look could be attributed to the same pulmonary disease that took her life. But to the God-fearing, terrified farmers of Exeter, this was not evidence of a natural process. This was the unholy proof their folklore had promised them. Blood. The life force. She had been hoarding it. She had been feeding. The verdict was instantaneous and unanimous. It was Mercy. Mercy, the youngest daughter, the one who died so quickly. She was the one who was visiting her brother Edwin in the night, sitting on his chest, stealing his breath, draining his life away to sustain her own unnatural existence in the grave. The investigation was over. The hunt was done. They had found their vampire. And now, the ritual had to be completed. The horror of that March morning was only just beginning. In the grip of a conviction that bordered on religious fervor, the men knew what they had to do. There was no hesitation now, no room for doubt. The sight in Mercy's coffin had burned away all reason, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of superstitious terror. They had found the monster. Now they had to destroy its heart, the seat of its unholy power. On a large, flat rock, a short distance from the open graves, they built a fire. The flames leaped up, a hungry slash of orange and yellow against the bleak grey landscape. It was a pagan fire on consecrated Christian ground, an ancient rite clawing its way into the modern world. With a hunting knife that one of the farmers produced, the designated man, history does not record his name, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of a desire to protect him, leaned over Mercy's coffin. The act itself was one of brutal, functional butchery. There was no ceremony to it, only a grim, surgical purpose. He cut into the chest of the 19-year-old girl. He, a man who had likely known Hétis, since she was a child, who had perhaps watched her play in the fields, now violated her body in the most profound way imaginable. He carved out her heart. He carved out her liver. The organs, still holding their shape, dark and heavy with the blood they had found, were lifted from her body and carried to the waiting fire. The smell that rose from the flames was horrific. The smell of burning flesh, of cooking meat, a scent both familiar and utterly profane in this context. It mingled with the sharp, clean scent of the cold winter air, creating a nauseating perfume of death and desecration. The men stood and watched, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, their expressions grim and unreadable. They were destroying a demon. They were saving a life. This is what they told themselves. This is what they had to believe. George Brown stood by, a silent, hollowed-out witness to the mutilation of his own daughter's corpse. What could have been going through his mind is impossible to fathom. Was it hope? Was it horror? Or was it simply the dull, numb emptiness of a man who had lost everything and was now presiding over the wreckage? They tended the fire until the organs were completely consumed, reduced to a small pile of grey, greasy ash. The flames died down, leaving behind a smoking, blackened stain on the rock. The ritual was almost complete. The ashes were carefully collected, scraped from the stone into a small container. This was the medicine. This was the antidote to the vampire's curse, forged in fire and desecration. This powder, the incinerated remains of his sister's heart, was the only thing they believed could save Edwin Brown. The small party left the cemetery, leaving behind them a scene of profound violation. 3 open graves, one containing a mutilated corpse. They returned to the Brown farmhouse, carrying with them their grotesque remedy. They entered the sick room where Edwin lay, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sickness, heavy and still. Edwin was conscious but weak, his eyes large and haunted in his emaciated face. They explained to him what they had done. They told him that they had found the source of his illness, that it was his sister Mercy, and that they had destroyed her power. They told him that he had to drink the ashes. He had to consume the last vestiges of the thing that was consuming him. Imagine that moment, lying on what you know is your deathbed, racked with pain and unable to breathe, and your father and neighbours come to you with a cup. And in that cup is a mixture of water and the charred remains of your beloved younger sister. What would you do? Would you recoil in horror? Or, in the depths of your suffering, would you cling to any hope, no matter how monstrous? Edwin Brown, desperate for any reprieve from his agony, any chance at life, took the cup. He drank the mixture. He swallowed the ashes of his sister's heart. He performed the final act in this gruesome drama, an act of ritualistic cannibalism born of sheer abject terror. He drank it down, and then they all waited. They waited for the miracle. They waited for the curse to break. They waited for the son to be saved. The cure did not work. The miracle never came. The desperate, violent, and profane ritual performed on that cold March morning was for nothing. Edwin Brown continued to decline. The ashes of his sister's heart offered no magic, no reprieve from the relentless march of the tuberculosis that was destroying his lungs. The consumption was a disease of the body, a physical ailment that could not be frightened away by folklore or burned out by fire. It was indifferent to their fear, their beliefs, their terrible sacrifices. Less than 2 months after the exhumation and the ritual, Edwin Brown died. He was the last of the children, the final hope of the Brown family line. The shadow that had fallen over the house Y years ago had finally completed its work. It had taken the mother, and then one daughter, then another, and now, finally, the son. The great and terrible act of desecrating Mercy's grave had been utterly, tragically pointless. It had not saved Edwin. It had only added a layer of profound horror and shame to the family's immense grief. The silence that descended upon the Brown farmhouse after Edwin's death was a different kind of silence than the one that had begun this story. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of aftermath, the silence of a void. George Brown was now utterly alone, a man who had buried his wife and all of his children. He was a man who had been persuaded by the fear of his community to commit an act that now must have seemed like a grotesque madness. He had stood by while his daughter's body was cut apart and burned. And for what? His son was still gone. The curse, if there ever was one, had won. Or, more accurately, the disease had simply run its natural, brutal course. The community of Exeter was left to grapple with what it had done. The story, spread by the attending reporter and by word of mouth, became a sensation, a flash of Gothic horror in the pages of newspapers across the country. The accounts painted the people of Exeter as backward, superstitious folk, clinging to the dark beliefs of a bygone era. The story was treated as a curiosity, a chilling piece of American folklore come to life. For the people of the town, it became a source of deep and lasting shame. The panic subsided, replaced by the cold, hard light of day. In that light, their actions seemed monstrous. The fear that had felt so real, so rational in the dead of winter, now looked like a collective delusion, a fever dream from which they had all awakened. The grave of Mercy Brown was closed. A simple headstone was erected. It reads, Mercy L. Brown, daughter of George T. and Mary E. Brown, died Jan. 17, 1892, aged 19 years, Tumos, 28 days. A simple stone, hiding a truly horrific story. Historians and folklorists would later study the case of Mercy Brown, labeling it the last great vampire panic in America. It was not an isolated incident. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, similar events had occurred across New England. In rural, isolated communities ravaged by epidemics of consumption, the vampire folklore provided an explanation for the unexplainable. It gave people a sense of agency, however misguided. A disease like tuberculosis was an invisible, implacable enemy. You couldn't fight it, you couldn't see it. But a vampire was a body in a grave. It was a tangible thing. You could dig it up. You could cut out its heart. You could burn it. The ritual, as gruesome as it was an act of fighting back. It was an attempt to impose order on a chaotic and terrifying world. The case of Mercy Brown occurred at a crucial tipping point in history. It was one of the last gasps of the old world of folklore before the new world of scientific understanding, of germ theory, took hold completely. Just a few years before, Robert Koch had identified the tubercle bacillus, the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. The scientific explanation for the Brown family's tragedy was already out there, in medical journals and lecture halls, but that knowledge had not yet penetrated the deep, frozen soil of rural Exeter. For the people there, the monster in the grave was a more powerful, more believable explanation than the monster in the air they breathed. And so, Mercy Brown, an innocent 19-year-old girl who had the misfortune of dying from a terrible disease at the wrong time and in the wrong place, was transformed by fear into a monster. Her memory was forever stained, her body forever desecrated, by the people who were trying, in their own desperate way, to save themselves. The years passed. The snows of many winters fell upon Chestnut Hill Cemetery, airy, covering the graves of the Brown family. George Brown lived out his days, a lonely figure in a house full of ghosts, eventually to be buried alongside the wife and children he had lost. The town of Exeter moved on, its dark secret becoming a whispered legend, a story told to frighten children on Halloween. The world changed. Science progressed. The fear of consumption was replaced by antibiotics in sanatoriums. The belief in the dead feeding on the living retreated from the realm of possibility into the realm of fiction and fantasy. The story of Mercy Brown became a historical footnote, a bizarre anomaly from a less enlightened time. But to dismiss it as such is to miss the true, enduring horror of the tale. The story of Mercy Brown is not really about vampires. It is about us. It is about what lies dormant within the human heart. It is about the terrifying power of fear and how it can strip away reason, compassion, and even the most sacred bonds of love. It is about how a community, gripped by a panic, can turn on its own and commit unspeakable acts in the name of salvation. The monster in this story was not the young woman lying in her coffin. The monster was the fear itself, a contagion of the mind, far more potent and destructive than any disease of the body. And so we are left here, in the quiet of this old cemetery, the wind whispering through the trees. The stones are cold to the touch. The story feels distant, a relic of a superstitious past. We tell ourselves that we are different now. We are enlightened. We have science. We have reason. We would never be driven to such extremes. We would never dig up our dead, searching for monsters. But is that true? Or has the nature of our fears simply changed? Do we not still look for scapegoats in times of crisis? Do we not still allow panic to cloud our judgment? Do we not still, in the darkest hours sometime, turn to desperate, irrational rituals to try and make sense of a world that feels like it is spinning out of control?